I'm going back to my ex, my husband said after 15 years of marriage, his voice flat, almost rehearsed, like he'd been waiting for this line his whole life. I never really loved you. The words landed quietly, but they cut deeper than any scream ever could. I just nodded, and in that silence he thought he had won. He expected begging, tears, desperation, maybe even anger, but I gave him nothing. Just that small nod. What he didn't understand was that behind it lived years of observation, years of watching his late-night work calls, the phone always face down, the rushed excuses when he stepped outside, the flashes of a smile he thought I'd never catch. I always caught them. I just pretended I didn't. And now, as he stood there, so sure of himself, he believed he was the one in control. That smirk, the one I hated most, crept across his face as he picked up his keys. He thought he was about to start over, free and untouchable, while I'd be left broken. But that smirk lit something inside me, because 15 years of marriage had taught me how to wait, how to endure, how to keep my mouth shut and my eyes open. And most importantly, how to collect evidence. He had no idea that behind his casual, "I'm leaving," was a storm I'd been preparing for. And soon enough, he'd learn what it feels like when silence fights back. He left the house that evening without looking back, and the silence he left behind pressed on my chest like a weight. But I didn't collapse the way he hoped I would. I stood in the living room staring at the closed door and remembered every single compromise I had made for this marriage, every opportunity I had given up so he could build his career, every holiday spent with his family where I swallowed their backhanded comments, every bill I had managed while he spent without care. And it was like my entire life with him replayed in brutal clarity, showing me that I had been cast in the role of caretaker, manager, quiet supporter, while he enjoyed being the star. The man everyone praised for his charm, his confidence, his supposed loyalty, and the truth was, I had been the one keeping everything together, paying attention to the smallest details, balancing accounts, keeping records, and most importantly, keeping copies, because somewhere deep down, I always knew there would come a day when I'd need them. In the early years, he liked to remind me that he was the one with the real job, that my part-time work and household management didn't count as much, and I let him believe that, because I had no interest in fighting over ego. But every paycheck that passed through our account, every bonus he bragged about at parties, I quietly documented. I had folders on the computer, flash drives, even printed statements in sealed envelopes, and when he started becoming careless, when dinners with colleagues turned into entire weekends away, I added those too. Hotel receipts tucked into his suit pockets, credit card statements with names of places I'd never been, the time he bought jewelry I never received, all of it layered and hidden like sediment, until I had built a record of his double life piece by piece. The irony is he thought I was oblivious, that I lived in some fog of denial, but I was sharper than he ever imagined, and the moment he admitted the truth himself, he signed his own downfall. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, opened my laptop, and scrolled through the folder labeled simply Household, the one he never bothered to ask about, and there it was. 15 years of evidence, 15 years of transactions, copies of emails, transfers between accounts, even the deed paperwork where my name appeared alongside his because his parents insisted on a joint purchase to keep the family secure. And I remembered how smug he had been, telling me it was just a formality, that I didn't really own half, that it was his family's business, but legally it was ours, and now that signature would become my weapon. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I didn't even drink the glass of wine I poured. I just organized, highlighted, and stapled because I knew the next morning I would call the lawyer I'd quietly consulted 2 years earlier when he first slipped and called me by another woman's name in our own kitchen. And I knew exactly how this would play out. He thought leaving was his decision, but in truth, I had been preparing for this moment longer than he realized. And while he slept in some other woman's bed that night, confident in his fresh start, I was sitting in mine constructing the endgame. The next morning, the house felt different. Not empty the way he intended, but almost cleansed. As if by speaking his betrayal out loud, he had freed me from the invisible leash I'd carried for 15 years. And with that freedom came clarity sharper than I'd ever felt before. I brewed coffee. Not for two, but just for myself. And instead of checking my phone to see if he'd messaged, I opened the drawer where I kept the business cards I'd collected quietly over the years. Attorneys, financial advisors, One private investigator whose number I'd written down during a conversation I pretended not to care about at a neighborhood gathering. I chose the lawyer first, a woman named Ellen who had looked me straight in the eyes 2 years ago and told me, "If you ever need me, call, but don't wait until he takes the first strike. Timing matters." And I realized I had perfect timing now. Within an hour, I was sitting across from her in her downtown office, the stack of files in my bag heavier than the betrayal in my chest. And when I laid them out on the polished desk, Ellen's eyebrows lifted in quiet admiration. "You've been preparing," she said, flipping through highlighted receipts, emails printed with subject lines that dripped with evidence, and the deed paperwork with both our names on it. "This isn't just divorce material, this is leverage." The word leverage felt like armor sliding onto my skin, and for the first time in years, I felt protected. Ellen explained how the assets were structured, how the joint property worked, how his family company had tied itself to us in ways they probably assumed I'd never notice. But I had noticed, and I had copies, and that meant I wasn't walking away with nothing. I was walking away with half, maybe more, depending on how reckless he had been with mixing personal and business finances. As Ellen mapped out the strategy, I thought back to every dinner where his parents praised him for being the responsible son and dismissed me as just the wife, the invisible background character, and I couldn't help but smile at the thought of them realizing the law didn't see me that way. The law saw me as co-owner, as equal, and their empire was about to be sliced down the middle because their golden boy had been sloppy. Later that day, I drove to our joint bank, not to withdraw, not to panic, but to request certified copies of our account history and the manager, who had known me for years as the one who handled deposits and reconciliations, while my husband strutted around playing big shot, printed them with a sympathetic nod, sliding the thick envelope across the counter like she knew exactly what was happening without needing to ask. That night, when he came back to collect more of his things, acting casual, humming a tune, pretending we were two adults parting on good terms, I stood in the doorway of the study and watched him pack, and instead of confronting him, instead of asking him why or how, I simply said, "Make sure you take everything you need tonight, because soon this won't be your address anymore." He laughed, that dismissive little chuckle that always made me feel like a child, and said, "You don't mean that. You'll calm down." But what he didn't see was the flash drive in my hand, the one I'd just copied our entire financial history onto, the one that would be on Ellen's desk tomorrow morning. He thought my nod was surrender, but it was the signal of a war he never saw coming, and with every signature he'd left behind, every careless mistake, I was about to show him exactly what silence can build. 2 days later, Ellen filed the papers, and I didn't tell him in person. I let the envelope do it, a thick packet served to him at work in front of his colleagues. The golden boy blindsided in the lobby where he used to strut with coffee in hand and a smile plastered on his face. I wasn't there, but I heard from a mutual acquaintance how his jaw tightened, how his smirk evaporated the second he flipped through the first pages and realized this wasn't some emotional wife throwing a tantrum. This was a calculated legal strike backed with years of documentation. The petition laid out everything: grounds for divorce, joint property claims, financial misconduct, even references to his infidelity woven in with receipts, dates, and times so precise that his lawyer would have no room to maneuver. That evening, my phone exploded with calls, first from him, then from his mother, then from numbers I didn't recognize, and I let them all go to voicemail, because the sound of their desperation was sweeter than any apology they could try to muster. His mother finally left a message, her voice dripping with the same false warmth she'd always used when she wanted something. "Darling, we really need to talk about this privately. No need to drag the company into your my feelings. As if 15 years of being treated like the unpaid manager of their son's life could be reduced to a fit of temper. I replayed that message twice, each time smiling wider, because she had just admitted in her own words that the company was on the line, that they knew I had leverage they couldn't spin away at a dinner party. Meanwhile, Ellen worked faster than I expected, sending subpoenas for bank records, drawing connections between his expense reports and the company card, pulling threads that revealed how often he blurred the line between personal indulgence and business costs, and every blurred line widened my share. The man who told me I didn't contribute enough to deserve anything was suddenly fighting to prove I had contributed too much, and it was a fight he couldn't win. At home, I stayed calm, I watered the plants, I cooked simple meals for myself. And when neighbors asked where he was, I just said, "He moved out," and let the silence hang long enough for them to fill in the blanks. By the end of the week, whispers spread. People had seen him storming into his parents' house, his father shouting in the driveway, his mother pacing with a glass of wine. And I didn't have to lift a finger for their perfect facade to start cracking. The family that once dismissed me as a footnote now had my name stamped across their balance sheets. And every night I slept a little deeper, knowing they were lying awake, trying to figure out how the woman they underestimated became the woman holding the pen that could split their empire. A week later, he finally showed up at my door. Not the confident man who had walked out announcing his grand return to his ex, but a pale, frantic version of himself, eyes bloodshot, jaw tight, clutching a folder of his own as if he could bargain his way out of the trap he'd walked into. "We need to talk," he said, and for the first time in 15 years, I didn't step aside to let him in. I just leaned against the doorframe and folded my arms. He launched into excuses. Claims that I was overreacting, that this was supposed to be amicable, that dragging lawyers and assets into it was unnecessary. He tried to sell me the same line he'd been feeding me our whole marriage, that his choices mattered more, that my silence meant compliance. But I wasn't silent now. I reminded him that he had signed the deed with my name beside his, that his paychecks had flowed into joint accounts, that the business dinners had been booked on cards we both carried. Every word was a nail, and I watched the realization dawn on his face that the woman he thought was just a background character had been taking notes the whole time. He tried switching tactics, softening his voice, almost whispering, "Look, I made a mistake, but you don't want to destroy everything, do you?" My parents are terrified, and hearing that word, terrified, was like music, because it confirmed what Ellen had told me earlier that week. The family company was entangled enough that if this went to trial, not only would he lose half, but their books could be dragged into discovery, exposing practices they'd hidden for years. That's when I said the sentence that made his face collapse. Then maybe they should have treated me as part of the family instead of a maid with paperwork. He didn't answer. Just stared, and I closed the door in his face before he could spin another lie. Inside, my hands were shaking, but not from fear, shaking from the release of 15 years of swallowed words finally breaking free. That night, Ellen called with an update. His lawyer had tried to propose a quick settlement, offering me the house and a modest payout, hoping I'd grab the bait. But she had refused on my behalf because we both knew what my evidence was worth. "He's panicking," she said, "and panicked men make mistakes." And she was right. 2 days later, new documents surfaced. Transfers between his personal account and the company's, expenses disguised as consulting fees, hotel charges written off as client meetings, all of which painted a picture not just of infidelity, but of financial misconduct serious enough to invite outside scrutiny. I didn't even have to push. His own carelessness was tightening the noose. As I sat at my kitchen table with the papers spread out, I realized that revenge wasn't a single blow. It was a slow, precise dismantling. And the best part was watching him realize, piece by piece, that I wasn't destroying him. He had destroyed himself. And I was just the mirror forcing him to look. By the second month, the fight had shifted completely. And it wasn't me chasing him for scraps of dignity or security. It was him scrambling to contain the fallout while I sat back and let the process unfold. Ellen had filed motions to freeze certain accounts, and within days, he discovered he no longer had the endless liquidity he'd flaunted for years. His credit cards were flagged, his access to business accounts restricted pending review, and the same man who once sneered that I wouldn't survive without him was suddenly the one calling me late at night. His voice strained, asking if I'd consider talking this out before things went too far. Too far? As if there was a line left to cross after he'd stood in our kitchen and told me he'd never loved me. Meanwhile, his family tried every angle. His mother arrived uninvited one afternoon with a box of pastries, pretending to check in, but really fishing for information, her eyes scanning the kitchen for signs of weakness. I let her talk, let her offer pity disguised as concern, and when she finally said, "You know, for the sake of appearances, maybe you should reconsider taking this public," I simply opened a drawer, pulled out a folder, and laid down a copy of the deed with both our names in bold letters. Her hands twitched, her painted smile cracked, and for the first time in years, she was speechless in my presence. She left without finishing her coffee, and I knew the message had landed. This wasn't negotiable, this wasn't emotional, this was legal, and there was no spin to save them. At the same time, Ellen uncovered something even bigger. Buried in the company's filings were irregularities tied directly to my husband, sloppy overlaps between business and pleasure that hinted at tax fraud if anyone looked closely enough. Suddenly, what began as a divorce was spiraling into a potential federal investigation, and I didn't have to lift a finger. The documents spoke for themselves. My role was simply to keep breathing, keep showing up, keep refusing to back down. At night, I'd walk through the house, running my hands over furniture I had chosen, walls I had painted, rooms I had cleaned, and instead of feeling sorrow at losing the life we'd built, I felt an almost electric pride that this time the house didn't echo with his voice, only mine. Every plant I watered, every meal I cooked just for myself was a quiet victory, a reminder that I wasn't surviving. I was reclaiming. And somewhere across town, he was watching his empire fracture. His parents' disappointment turned to blame. His ex, the one he left me for, began to realize that she hadn't inherited a golden future, but a man dragging scandal behind him. That was the real revenge, not screaming, not begging, but watching his world collapse while mine finally, after 15 years, began to expand. By the third month, his mask had crumbled so badly that even the people who once worshipped him started to distance themselves. Colleagues who used to laugh at his jokes now avoided his gaze in the hallway. Friends who once bragged about knowing him suddenly stopped answering his calls. And his own family, the fortress he believed would always protect him, began to fracture under the pressure. Ellen kept me updated in calm, steady tones, telling me how his lawyer's tone shifted from arrogance to desperation, how they first tried to dismiss my claims as emotional exaggeration, then attempted lowball settlements, then finally resorted to begging for mediation once they realized the evidence couldn't be buried. And all the while I said nothing directly to him, no angry texts, no pleading emails, just silence that drove him insane. Because silence meant he couldn't predict me, couldn't manipulate me, couldn't control the narrative. The silence was my sharpest weapon. At the same time, the investigation into his finances widened, and when Ellen showed me documents confirming that regulatory agencies had started sniffing around the company, I almost laughed out loud because it wasn't me pulling those strings. It was his own arrogance dragging them into the light. I remembered all those nights when he had smirked at me over dinner, telling me I was too cautious, that I worried too much about details, that I should just let him handle things, and now those very details were the cracks splitting his foundation apart. His ex, the woman he'd so triumphantly declared he was going back to, apparently didn't find scandal and financial ruin as attractive as he thought, because word spread quickly that she had packed up and left once the subpoenas hit, leaving him standing alone in the wreckage of his choices. Neighbors whispered about it, coworkers gossiped about it, and I didn't have to say a single word to make sure the story reached every corner of his world. I focused instead on myself. I signed up for a painting class I had always wanted to try. I reconnected with friends I had neglected while managing his chaos. I even took a weekend trip by myself, just to feel what it was like to move through the world without explaining my every step to someone waiting to criticize. For the first time in 15 years, I wasn't shrinking to fit inside someone else's shadow. I was taking up space, filling my own life with color and sound. Meanwhile, his calls became more frantic, his voicemails more disjointed, swinging between rage and pleading, sometimes within the same message, like a man drowning who didn't know whether to curse the waves or beg for rescue. And each time I listened, then pressed delete because he was no longer my problem. He had chosen his path with that single sentence: "I never really loved you." And all I had done was refuse to move out of the way when the consequences came barreling down. The day of the court hearing arrived like the final act of a play I'd already memorized, the air heavy with anticipation as I walked into the courthouse in a navy dress that fit like armor. Not too flashy, not too soft, just precise, just enough to remind him and everyone watching that I was no longer the silent wife in the background. He sat across the aisle looking smaller than I had ever seen him, his suit slightly wrinkled, his eyes darting to the doors as though waiting for someone to rush in and save him. But no one came. Not his ex, not his friends, not even his parents. Because by then, they knew attaching their names to his mess would only stain them further. When the judge began to review the case, the room shifted. Page after page of evidence I had collected was entered into the record. My years of quiet observation laid out in black and white: hotel bills, transfers, emails, contracts, and that all-important deed with both our signatures. My husband's lawyer tried to argue, tried to dismiss, but every protest collapsed under the weight of documentation. The judge's tone grew sharper with each rebuttal, at one point pausing to ask, "Did your client really believe these expenses would withstand scrutiny?" The courtroom chuckled quietly, and I sat still, my hands folded in my lap because I didn't need to gloat. His unraveling was spectacle enough. And then came the part he hadn't prepared for. When Ellen presented the ties between his personal misconduct and the family company, the judge leaned back, eyebrows raised, and said calmly, "Given the joint ownership and financial commingling, Mrs. Carter is entitled to 50% stake in the marital portion of these assets, including the company's shares." For a second, everything went silent. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. And I watched his face drain of color, the smirk gone, the swagger erased, replaced by the raw recognition that in trying to discard me, he had handed me the knife to cut his empire in half. He whispered something to his lawyer, shaking his head furiously. But it didn't matter. The ruling was on record, the gavel struck, and just like that, the empire his family had built with smug certainty was no longer theirs alone. I didn't smile, I didn't gloat, I just stood when it was done, gathered my bag, and walked past him without a glance, because the real revenge wasn't in the ruling. It was in the knowledge that he had crafted this ending himself, brick by brick, lie by lie, until there was nothing left for him to stand on. Outside the courthouse, reporters were waiting, cameras flashing, and though I didn't speak, the image of me walking away while he slumped in the doorway said more than words ever could. 15 years of silence had finally found their voice, and it echoed louder than his excuses ever would. In the weeks after the ruling, the silence from him and his family was almost louder than their shouting had ever been, because silence from them meant surrender. It meant they had run out of angles, out of leverage, out of the smug confidence they had carried like a second skin for years. And I walked through my days with a kind of lightness I hadn't felt since before the marriage began. Friends reached out cautiously at first, some confessing they had seen the cracks in him long ago, but never dared to say anything. Others apologizing for believing the facade he had sold so well. And though part of me wanted to be angry at them for their silence, another part simply felt relief that the truth was finally undeniable. I threw myself into reclaiming pieces of myself I had lost. I enrolled in a course at the community college, started sketching again, reconnected with women I had drifted away from because he didn't approve of their independence. And with every small choice, I felt a layer of his control peeling off my skin. Meanwhile, the fallout around him only deepened. Rumors swirled that the company was under audit, that investors were pulling out quietly, that his own father had told him not to step foot in their offices until things settled. And the same man who once bragged about being indispensable was now an embarrassment they wished they could erase. I didn't need to see him to know he was unraveling. I could feel it in the way messages stopped coming, in the way mutual acquaintances looked at me with curiosity tinged with pity when they mentioned his name. Ellen kept me informed on the legal side, reassuring me that the assets were secure, the shares transferred, the settlement airtight. And each time she said the words airtight or finalized, I felt another knot in my chest loosen. I started sleeping through the night again, the kind of deep, unbroken sleep I hadn't known since before the late-night phone calls, the whispered excuses, the creeping suspicion that had lived with me for so many years. One Saturday, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the sunrise, and I realized I didn't feel like a victim or even just a survivor. I felt like someone who had rewritten her own ending, who had refused to let betrayal be the final chapter. And yet, the most satisfying part wasn't even the financial victory or the legal recognition. It was the quiet justice of watching the man who thought he owned me become a cautionary tale. The man who declared he never loved me, now standing alone with nothing left to love him back. Not his ex, not his parents, not the colleagues who once applauded him. I didn't need to see his face to know what it looked like in those moments of isolation. I had seen the cracks form in court, and I knew now they had widened into collapse. Revenge, I learned, wasn't fire and fury. It was patience, precision, and the strength to sit still while the person who underestimated you handed you every tool to dismantle them. And as I folded laundry that afternoon, humming to myself in a house finally filled with peace, I thought about how his story had ended, and how mine, after 15 years of silence, was only beginning. Months later, when the dust had finally settled and the last signatures were stamped into permanence, I stood in my own kitchen, the same one where he had once leaned against the counter and told me he never loved me. And I realized the space didn't hold the echo of his words anymore. It held mine. The house was legally mine now. The company shares transferred into my name, and every trace of his presence had been erased, not with rage, but with deliberate, patient rebuilding. I donated the suits he left behind, repainted the walls he used to criticize, planted flowers in the yard he never cared to notice. And with each act, I rewrote the narrative of this place into one that belonged solely to me. His family tried once more, sending a lawyer with an offer that came wrapped in false politeness, begging me to consider the legacy and sell my stake back for a tidy sum. But I declined without hesitation, because legacy wasn't theirs to define anymore. It was mine, carved into legal record and unshakable. The last I heard, he was living in a small rental on the edge of town, his career in shambles, his ex long gone, his phone calls fewer and fewer as people stopped answering. I didn't need updates. I didn't crave them. My revenge was never about watching him suffer. It was about finally stepping out of the role he cast me in and owning the power I had always carried quietly inside. And now, walking through my days with freedom, with my own money, my own choices, my own voice, I understood the true weight of that night when I just nodded instead of breaking down. That nod wasn't surrender. It was a promise to myself. A signal that I would no longer beg for respect. I would claim it. 15 years had ended with a single sentence from him, but the rest of my life began with silence from me. And in that silence, I built something stronger than love ever was. I built myself. So, when people ask how I survived, I tell them simply this. Sometimes revenge is not fire or fury. Sometimes it is patience, paperwork, and the courage to let someone dig their own grave while you quietly collect the shovel. And then I smile, sip my tea, and remind myself that I am free. What about you? Would you have stayed quiet and waited? Or would you have burned it all down in the moment? Tell me in the comments where you're listening from.